The year is 1944. An American general stands before tens of thousands of soldiers and tells them straight to their faces, Americans don't have a tradition of losing. Your job isn't to die for your country. It's to make the enemy die for his. He was fired 3 times, condemned by the entire world, despised even by his own comrades. But without him, Germany might very well have never been defeated. Under his command, the Third Army liberated more than 10,000 square kilometers in just 3 weeks. He pivoted an entire army in the dead of a freezing winter night to rescue 20,000 surrounded soldiers, something no general in history had dared to promise could be done in 48 hours. But he also slapped a soldier suffering from combat trauma in the middle of a field hospital. He said things that even his allies could not forgive. And he died in a minor accident just weeks before coming home, under circumstances that, to this day, have never been satisfactorily explained. This is the story of George S. Patton. Not a hero, not a villain, but something more terrifying than either, a completely real human being. Before the story begins, hit subscribe so you can step into the world of figures who changed history and the secrets that textbooks never told. Or, if you're not ready for that, a like and a comment help other curious minds find us. And now, let's begin the story of George S. Patton, America's legendary tank general of World War II. Chapter 1. Warrior blood runs through his veins. On November 11th, 1885, in the small town of San Gabriel, California, a child was born into a family where war was not something to be feared. War was a source of pride. The Patton family was not wealthy in the way of money. They were wealthy in a different way. George's great-grandfather, who bore the same name, had been a colonel in the Confederate Army throughout the American Civil War. He fell in battle in 1864 at Cedar Creek, Virginia, leading his men in a charge against enemy positions. No retreat, no surrender. Dying on horseback like a true warrior. Then came his grandfather, then his father. Every generation of the Patton family had someone who put on a uniform. Stories of battle were told and retold in the household, the way fairy tales are told to children before bed. But instead of princes slaying dragons, those stories were all cavalry breaking sieges, cannons roaring, and men dying in glory. Young George grew up breathing that air, and he absorbed all of it. But there is a secret that few people know about this celebrated general. George Patton could not read until the age of 12. He had dyslexia. The letters on the page would leap around chaotically before his eyes, reversing themselves, overlapping, refusing to stay in place. While children his age were reading fluently, young George was still sounding out words, one laborious letter at a time. His father, rather than forcing his son to learn in the conventional way, did something far smarter. He read aloud to his son every evening. Not children's stories, but the Bible, Homer's Iliad, historical accounts of Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, Napoleon Bonaparte. And George Patton's exceptional mind, though unable to read the written word, possessed another ability so remarkable it bordered on the frightening. Near-perfect auditory memory. Hear something once, and it stayed forever. Hear it 10 times, and it was burned into his brain, word for word, as if branded there. By the age of 10, young George could recount Caesar's entire Gallic campaign without glancing at a book. At 12, he argued with his father about Napoleon's tactics at the Battle of Austerlitz. Not the kind of argument children have. A real debate, with facts, with reasoning, with the confidence of someone who had examined the question from every angle. His father looked at his son and understood that what was growing up inside that house was no ordinary child. But the strangest thing about George Patton was not his extraordinary memory, not his passion for history. It was a belief he carried in his heart for the entirety of his life, one he never abandoned, never felt ashamed to speak aloud. George Patton believed he had lived before, not once, but many times, across centuries, across wars, across different bodies. He believed his soul had once gripped a spear in the armies of Alexander the Great, had once stood on the warships of Carthage, had once marched under Caesar's banner across the soil of Gaul. In 1943, when he set foot on the ancient land of Carthage in Tunisia, North Africa, he stopped and told his aide, "I've been here before. I know this road." Then he led the group down a shortcut without a map, arriving at exactly the right destination. People may laugh, may dismiss it as fantasy, but George Patton did not laugh. To him, it was as plain a truth as the blue sky overhead. And that belief, however strange it may sound, produced something extraordinarily dangerous in a general: the complete absence of fear. As George Patton grew older, there was no question about what he would do with his life. The only question was when he would put on that uniform, and whether it would fit. His goal was singular: the United States Military Academy at West Point, the most prestigious institution in America, the forge of generals who changed history. In 1903, Patton applied to West Point and failed. Mathematics defeated him entirely. The mind that could recite every one of Napoleon's battles from memory refused to cooperate with the cold, dry numbers on a page. Another man might have given up, chosen a different school, a different path, told himself that fate had said no. But George Patton did not have that word in his vocabulary. He enrolled at the Virginia Military Institute for a year, gritting his teeth through mathematics, drilling himself in the very subject he despised most. Not because he loved math, but because math was the only door that led where he needed to go. In 1904, he sat the exam again. This time, he passed. West Point was no paradise for Patton. In his first year, he was held back again because of mathematics, forced to repeat the year with the class behind him. For a man as proud as he was, this was a humiliation that was not easily swallowed. Those who had entered with him moved forward, while he stood still. But it was also at West Point that people began to see qualities that could not be faked. In tactical instruction sessions, Patton was always the first to answer, quickly and usually correctly. His tactics instructors noted that this cadet thought about the battlefield in a way entirely unlike the others, not by the textbook, but by the instinct of someone who had genuinely been there before. Beyond tactics, Patton distinguished himself in another arena: athletics. He trained with an intensity that many of his peers considered extreme. Running before dawn, fencing until his hands went numb, riding until both horse and rider were spent. Not to win medals, but because he believed a weak body was a betrayal of the spirit in the moments that mattered most. In 1909, George Smith Patton graduated from West Point, ranked 46th out of 103 cadets, not distinguished on paper. But the finest instructors at the academy men who had looked out over thousands of cadets across their careers, knew that the number 46 said nothing meaningful about this man. Before stepping into the wars that would shake the world, let us pause for a moment to understand who this man truly was. Because if we look only at the battles, we will see only half the story. George Patton was the kind of man you could not walk past on the street without noticing, not because he was tall or conventionally handsome, but because he possessed something that cannot quite be captured in language. People usually call it presence. Few know that Patton was a prolific writer. He kept a diary nearly every day of his life. He wrote poetry, not accomplished by literary standards, but genuine by the measure of emotion. He wrote long letters to his wife, spanning many pages, recounting battles, the fears he would never admit before his soldiers, the quiet doubts that gnawed at him in the dead of night. The man with the foulest mouth in the history of the American military. The man whose footsteps made soldiers tense. The man whom German generals called the most dangerous adversary on the Allied side. That man went home and wrote poetry for his wife. Beatrice Eyre, the woman he loved and married in 1910, was the only person in his life he truly listened to. She came from a wealthy Boston family, intelligent, self-possessed, and strong enough to live alongside a man like Patton without being consumed by him. For 40 years of marriage, wherever in the world he was stationed, letters passed between them as steadily as breathing. Another paradox. Patton prayed every day. The Bible he carried throughout World War II still survives today, every page annotated in pencil. Before every major battle, he prayed. Not in a perfunctory, formal way, but the way one speaks honestly with someone they truly trust. Praying and swearing, reading the Bible and believing in reincarnation, loving his wife with tenderness and being ice-cold ruthless on the battlefield. Patton was not a man who could be neatly sorted into any single category, and that is precisely why his story is worth telling. Not because he was a saint, not because he was a villain, but because he was a human being, in all the greatness and all the darkness those two words can hold. In 1909, this man walked out through the gates of West Point with an officer's sword hanging at his hip for the first time. He did not know that he would have to wait another 35 years before standing in the place where history needed him to stand. But he would not miss that moment, not for anything in the world. Chapter 2. First Steps from Cavalry to Tanks. After graduating from West Point in 1909, Patton was assigned to the cavalry. For many young officers of that era, the cavalry was the branch of gentlemen, of men who wanted to look dashing on horseback more than they wanted to actually fight. But for Patton, the cavalry was where he could hone what he believed in most: speed, momentum, and the relentless spirit of attack. In the early years of his career, Patton developed an obsession with swordsmanship that bordered on the unusual. He did not study the sword merely as a military skill. He approached it like a scientist. He traveled to France to train under the finest fencing masters in Europe, bringing back techniques the American military had never encountered. In 1913, the War Department appointed him Master of the Sword, the official swordsmanship expert for the entire United States Army. He was 27 years old. It was the first time in the history of the American military that the title had been bestowed upon an officer so young. But before that happened, another event had put Patton's name in the newspapers for the very first time. In 1912, the Olympic Games were held in Stockholm, Sweden. Patton was selected to represent the United States in an event called the Modern Pentathlon. This was no sport for ordinary men. Competitors had to complete 5 entirely different disciplines in succession: pistol shooting, fencing, swimming, equestrian show jumping, and a cross-country run. The event was designed to simulate the ordeal of a cavalry officer on the battlefield, a man who must fight, swim across a river, ride hard, and keep running when his horse has fallen. Patton performed brilliantly in most disciplines. He placed first in fencing, third in swimming, fourth in equestrian. But then came the pistol shooting, and a small controversy arose that people argue about to this day. Patton fired, and several of his bullets left no holes in the target. The judges ruled that those shots had missed, and he was scored poorly for the event. But Patton insisted the bullets had not missed. They had passed clean through holes already made by earlier shots, because his aim was so precise. Was he right or wrong? No one could prove it conclusively, but if his account was correct, he should have finished first overall. When it was over, Patton placed 5th among 43 competitors from around the world. No medal, but he was the highest-placed American in the history of that event at the Olympics up to that point. The American press began to take notice of the name George Patton. More importantly, Patton himself took away a lesson from Stockholm that he would apply throughout his military career. No amount of preparation is ever truly enough. There is always something that can defeat you if you fail to control every variable. And when you lose, do not accept the result passively. Ask questions, analyze, find out why. In 1916, a man named Pancho Villa led his forces across the Mexican border and raided the town of Columbus, New Mexico, killing 18 Americans. It was the first time since the War of 1812 that a foreign force had struck directly on American soil. President Woodrow Wilson was furious and ordered troops into Mexico to hunt Villa down. The man chosen to command the expedition was General John Pershing, one of the most respected officers in America at the time. And Patton, with his characteristic persistence, found a way to attach himself to the campaign, even though his name was not on the original roster. He went to Pershing and said plainly, "General, I want to go. I will do whatever is needed." Pershing looked at the young officer standing before him and agreed. It was the beginning of a relationship between teacher and student that would shape Patton's career for many years to come. In Mexico, Patton served as an aide to Pershing and quickly noticed something that many other officers overlooked. Military automobiles were changing everything. While cavalry still rode horses, as they had for 100 years, motorized vehicles could move faster, carry more men, and required neither grass nor water. On May 14, 1916, Patton led a small detachment to a nearby ranch to buy corn for the horses. But when they arrived, he sensed something was wrong. The men at the ranch were concealing something. Their horses looked as though they had just been ridden hard from a distance, and Patton, his combat instincts always switched on, decided to stay and watch. Minutes later, a group of Mexican horsemen rode out from the ranch gate. Patton recognized them instantly as Pancho Villa's men. Among them was Julio Cardenas, one of Villa's most trusted commanders. A firefight broke out. Patton shot and killed 3 Mexicans, including Cardenas. In the context of war, that was unremarkable. What was not unremarkable was what Patton did next. He ordered the 3 bodies strapped across the hoods of 3 automobiles, and the convoy drove straight back to Pershing's camp, putting the trophies on display before the entire force. People may react to that image in different ways, but two things cannot be denied. First, Patton had completed his mission with absolute finality. Second, he understood the value of psychological warfare. The image spread across Mexico within days. Villa's soldiers who heard the name Patton began to grow wary. The American press called him the bandit killer. Pershing called him my little cowboy. And Patton, in a letter to his father, wrote, "I fired a gun in earnest for the first time. I did not shake. I was not afraid. I only saw everything more clearly than I ever had before." But the most important thing Patton brought back from Mexico was not fame, nor lessons in psychological warfare. It was the lesson of the automobile, of speed, of the machine that would replace the horse on the 20th century battlefield. When America declared war on Germany in April 1917 and began sending troops to France, the First World War had already dragged on for 3 years and claimed roughly 10 million lives. Both sides dug trenches, took cover, exchanged fire, and neither advanced a single step. Trench warfare was the most terrible thing the human mind had ever devised. Patton arrived in France alongside Pershing, continuing as aide to the general he admired most. But he wanted more. He wanted to fight. And then he saw the tanks. Tanks had appeared for the first time in the history of warfare in 1916 at the Battle of the Somme, deployed by the British. These enormous metal machines, running on tracks, could cross barbed wire and trenches that infantry could not. Most seasoned commanders looked at tanks with skepticism. They saw machines that broke down constantly, moved slowly, made too much noise, and were easy prey for artillery. They did not see the potential, but Patton did. When Pershing tasked him with building an American tank force from nothing, Patton threw himself into the work with the fervor of a man who had just found what he had been searching for all his life. He did not sit in the command room drawing up plans. He went down to the workshops, learned to drive a tank, learned to repair an engine, learned to service the tracks. He wanted to understand these machines from the inside out, from the bottom up, before he dared entrust soldiers' lives to them. He went to learn from the French and the British, the first tank forces in the world. He sat alongside veteran tank crews and asked questions that many senior officers would not bother asking, considering it work beneath their rank. Within a few months, he knew more about tanks than most of the men who had worked with them from the very beginning. But more important than technical knowledge was the fighting philosophy Patton began to develop during this period. He studied how the British and French were using tanks and immediately identified the problem. They used them too slowly. They kept tanks crawling step by step alongside the infantry, stopping when the infantry stopped, waiting when the infantry hesitated. Tanks, with their superior speed and firepower, had been reduced to slow support machines. Patton thought differently. He believed tanks had to advance fast, faster than the infantry could follow, driving straight into the enemy's rear, destroying supply lines, creating chaos. Do not attack where the enemy is strongest. Attack where the enemy least expects it. This was the seed of the entire military philosophy that would later change the course of the Second World War. In September 1918, Patton led his tank unit into the Meuse-Argonne offensive, one of the largest and most brutal engagements American forces fought in the First World War. And in that very first battle, the world saw just how different Patton was from every other commander around him. When the tanks advanced and the infantry faltered under enemy fire, Patton did not stay seated at his command post. He stepped out of cover, stood upright under fire, and directed his tanks forward by hand. The soldiers saw their commander standing exposed in the firestorm, not ducking, not retreating, and they moved forward with him. Then a bullet struck him in the thigh. Patton went down, but he would not let anyone carry him away. Lying in a mud hole, blood soaking through his trousers, he continued shouting orders to the soldiers around him until he was certain the attack was on course. Only then did he allow someone to dress his wound. He was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, one of the highest honors the American military bestows, for his bravery in that engagement. But in the letter he wrote to his wife after the battle, he included one line that people tend to overlook. "You know, I was afraid. I was more afraid than I expected to be. But I understood that if I stopped, everyone would stop. So I could not stop." That was not numbness, nor madness. It was the conscious choice of a man who understood that the role of a commander is not to survive. The role of a commander is to make other men willing to advance. The First World War ended in 1918. America returned to peacetime, and the military was sharply cut back. Defense budgets shrank, forces were demobilized, and men like Patton were left to wait in quiet postings, doing routine work, while the world around them went on living as though war had ended forever. This was the hardest period of Patton's life, not because he suffered any material hardship, but because he was forced to exist in the state he hated most, waiting with nothing to do. Throughout the 20 years between the two wars, Patton's rank advanced with agonizing slowness. He remained stuck at major and lieutenant colonel for so long that many around him began to assume he would retire without ever having had his moment. But Patton did not waste those years. He read, he thought, he wrote. He wrote essays on armored tactics, on how tanks should be used in future wars. When he submitted these pieces to military journals, they were typically ignored or criticized as too extreme, too theoretical, impractical. The conservative American military establishment still believed tanks were support weapons for the infantry. The idea of using armor as an independent striking force, punching deep into enemy territory, was dismissed as fantasy. Across the Atlantic, a German named Heinz Guderian was thinking along exactly the same lines as Patton, and the Germans listened to Guderian. In 1933, Adolf Hitler came to power in Germany. That year, Patton read Mein Kampf, the book Hitler had written in prison, laying out his entire ideology and ambitions. When he finished it, Patton told those around him that war was coming, that Germany was preparing while America was not, that what was unfolding in Europe was not someone else's problem. No one listened. Meanwhile, Germany was building its panzer divisions, powerful armored formations operating under the doctrine of rapid assault that Guderian had developed. They did not keep tanks alongside the infantry. They sent tanks ahead to break through, encircle, and destroy, with infantry following to finish the job. When German armor rolled into Poland in 1939 and crushed its entire military in just 3 weeks, the world finally began to understand. Patton watched the news from Europe and said nothing. He simply wrote a single short line in his diary. "I told them so." In 1940, France collapsed in 6 weeks before the German war machine. Britain stood alone, and America, though not yet at war, began rearming at a frantic pace. The military started to remember that it had men like Patton, men who had been thinking about this war before it began. In April 1941, Patton was promoted to Major General and given command of the 2nd Armored Division. After 20 years of waiting, he began to build what he had dreamed of from the mud-soaked trenches of France in 1918. He took the division to the Mojave Desert to train. Not performance training, real training, under the harshest conditions he could create. He drove tanks through the night, through sandstorms, without rest. He inspected every unit and punished anyone who slowed the advance for reasons he judged unacceptable. His soldiers resented him. Many of his subordinate officers despised him. But when those same units entered actual combat, they were ready in ways that other units simply were not. On December 7, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. America declared war on Japan and Germany. The Second World War had pulled the United States into its current. George Patton was 56 years old that year. For most men, that is the age of retirement. For Patton, it was the age of beginning. Chapter 3. North Africa and Sicily, from defeat to glory. To understand why Patton mattered in North Africa, you first need to understand just how bad things had become. In 1942, the North African theatre was a place where the Allies and the Germans fought over every inch of desert. On the German side stood Erwin Rommel, known to the entire world by his nickname, the Desert Fox. Rommel was a genuine tactical genius. He struck fast, struck without warning, and shifted his axis of attack so constantly that the Allies could never predict his next move. British soldiers had been fighting in North Africa since 1940 and had lost to Rommel far more often than they had beaten him. In November 1942, American forces landed in North Africa for the first time in Operation Torch. It was the first time American soldiers faced the Germans at scale, and they were not ready. Not for lack of weapons, not for lack of numbers, but because they had never truly tasted defeat. They arrived with the mindset of men who had not yet understood that war is not a training exercise with a referee who blows the whistle when things go wrong. February 14th, 1943, Valentine's Day. While Americans at home exchanged roses and chocolates, at the Kasserine Pass in Tunisia, the U.S. Army was suffering the most humiliating defeat in American military history since Pearl Harbor. Rommel unleashed 2 armored divisions against the American Second Corps. Not a frontal assault by the textbook, an attack from multiple directions simultaneously, moving so fast that American units had no time to react. Within 48 hours, the American line had completely collapsed. The Americans abandoned their equipment and ran. Not an orderly withdrawal, a rout. Tanks were left behind with fuel still in them. Ammunition dumps were abandoned before they could be destroyed. Units lost contact with each other. Officers did not know where their men were. Soldiers did not know which direction they were running. The toll after 3 days of fighting. Nearly 6,500 American soldiers killed, wounded, or captured. Around 200 tanks and armored vehicles destroyed or seized by the enemy. Some units lost up to 80% of their strength. Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander in North Africa, read the reports and understood immediately that the problem was not weapons or numbers. The problem was the men, their fighting spirit, their leadership. He needed someone who could walk into the wreckage and rebuild it into a fighting force. Not in months, in weeks. He called Patton. When Patton arrived in Tunisia on March 6, 1943, to take command of the Second Corps, the atmosphere hung as heavy as a funeral. Soldiers moved about carelessly, without helmets, without ties, every face wearing the expression of men who had been beaten and did not yet understand why. Subordinate officers spoke to each other in hushed tones, like patients in a hospital ward. Patton looked at the scene and felt what he described in his diary as a cold anger. Not an eruption of fury, but something cold, lucid, and far more dangerous. That very first morning in command, Patton issued a series of orders that many soldiers considered insane. All officers and enlisted men were to wear their helmets at all times, everywhere, including when using the latrine. All were to wear their ties properly. All were to maintain their uniforms to exact regulation standard. Violations would be punished with fines, no exceptions. And he sent men to inspect every corner of the command area, including the most remote and obscure posts, to ensure compliance. Soldiers reacted as though he had asked something unreasonable. Some subordinate officers muttered among themselves that the new general was worried about helmets and neckties, while the Germans were less than 50 miles away. But Patton knew precisely what he was doing. He did not care about helmets or neckties. What he cared about was discipline, and he understood something that most people did not. Discipline does not begin on the battlefield. It begins in the smallest habits of daily life. A soldier who will not wear his helmet properly when he is safe will not hold his position when he is in danger. A unit without discipline in camp will have no discipline when the bullets start flying. Beyond enforcing outward standards, Patton did something even more important. He changed the way his soldiers thought about themselves. He visited unit after unit, spoke directly to the men, not in polished speeches, but plainly, roughly, straight into the gut of what they were feeling. He told them they had not lost at Cavalry because they were cowards or because they were inferior. They lost because they had not been taught to fight properly, because the men who commanded them had not prepared them well enough, and that was about to change. Soldiers listened to Patton and felt something shift in their chests. Not quite inspiration, something closer to the return of self-respect. On March 23, 1943, just 17 days after Patton took command, 2nd Corps faced the German 10th Panzer Division at El Guetar. This was not the largest battle of the Second World War, but it carried a historical significance that few recognized at the time. It was the first occasion in the entire war that American forces defeated the Germans in a direct, head-on engagement. Patton did not let his men sit and wait to be attacked. He positioned his artillery first, laying traps along the axes he predicted the German tanks would use. When the 10th Panzer Division came charging in with the speed and confidence of men who had routed the Americans just 3 weeks earlier, they drove straight into a prepared kill zone. German tanks were picked off one by one. The attacking formation fell into chaos. The 10th Panzer Division was forced to withdraw, leaving dozens of destroyed tanks scattered across the sand. The outcome was not a crushing one-sided victory. American losses were also significant, but this time they held. This time they did not run. And for soldiers who had lived through Kasserine, that meant more than any medal. Eisenhower read the report and breathed. In 3 weeks, Patton had done what many believed was impossible. But Patton had no time to celebrate. The next plan was already waiting, and it was far larger. July 1943. The Allies were preparing to assault Sicily, the largest island in the Mediterranean and the gateway into continental Europe. Operation Husky was the largest amphibious landing in history up to that point, involving more than 150,000 troops, 3,000 warships and transport vessels, and 4,000 aircraft. In the original plan, Patton and his US 7th Army were assigned to guard the left flank of Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's British 8th Army. Put simply, Patton was given the support role, while Montgomery was to fight the main action and advance on Messina, Sicily's most important port city. Patton and Montgomery disliked each other. This was a fact everyone knew and no one bothered to conceal. Montgomery was a perfectionist, careful to the point of slowness, always preparing meticulously before moving, never attacking unless he was certain every piece was in place. Patton was his polar opposite. To Patton, attacking now with a serviceable plan was better than attacking later with a perfect one. The two men looked at each other and saw antitheses. On July 10, 1943, the Allies landed in Sicily. The Americans came ashore in the south, the British in the east. The plan called for Montgomery to drive straight north along the eastern coast and seize Messina. Patton would cover the flank. But things did not unfold as planned. Not because of failure, because of success arriving too fast. Patton's Americans advanced far more quickly than anticipated. While Montgomery was stalled in the east by strong German defensive lines, Patton recognized that the western half of the island was nearly undefended. The garrison there was mostly Italian soldiers who had little appetite for fighting a war they no longer believed in. Patton made a unilateral decision to expand his area of operations, without requesting permission, without waiting for orders. He turned his forces west, took Palermo, the capital of Sicily, then wheeled north toward Messina from the opposite direction to Montgomery. By the rules of military conduct, this was a decision so bold it bordered on insubordination. He had gone beyond his assigned mission without authorization from above. Had it failed, his career would have ended on the spot. But it did not fail. On July 22, 1943, American forces entered Palermo. Sicily's largest city surrendered after token resistance. The people of Sicily lined the streets, many bringing flowers and wine to offer to the American soldiers. It was the first time in the war that an American army had entered and liberated a major European city. Patton stood in his jeep as it drove into Palermo like a Roman general entering in triumph. He made no effort to hide the satisfaction on his face. After taking Palermo, Patton began the informal race that everyone knew was underway. Who would reach Messina first? The Americans or the British? For Patton, this was not merely a matter of personal pride or national ego. He believed that whoever reached Messina first would determine who held the initiative in the next phase of the war in Europe. Britain and Montgomery had set the terms of the campaign from the beginning. If America wanted to be treated as an equal partner rather than a support force, it needed to prove that on the battlefield. The road from Palermo to Messina was not easy. The terrain of northern Sicily was sheer mountains, narrow passes, and small bridges that could not bear the weight of tanks. The Germans had scattered defensive positions along the route, not strong enough to stop the advance outright, but enough to slow it. Patton refused to let terrain or the enemy slow him. He ordered multiple amphibious landings, sending forces by sea to strike behind German defensive positions, forcing them to withdraw or face encirclement. It was a fluid and creative application of combined arms that few commanders would have thought to employ in that kind of terrain. Patton's soldiers were exhausted. They had been fighting without pause since the day they landed. Their feet were blistered, their eyes red from sleeplessness, their mouths parched under the August sun of Sicily. But Patton did not give them rest. He visited unit after unit and told them that Messina lay ahead and the British were behind. That alone was enough to make many men grit their teeth and keep walking. On August 17, 1943, American forces entered Messina. 2 hours later, Montgomery's British forces arrived as well. 2 hours. That was the margin between Patton and Montgomery in a race of hundreds of kilometers through mountainous terrain. Patton stood at the gates of Messina and waited for Montgomery. When the British arrived, he greeted them with impeccable courtesy. But his eyes said everything he did not put into words. While the Sicilian campaign was entering its final stage, 2 incidents occurred that no one knew at the time would completely alter the course of Patton's career. Not on the battlefield, but in a field hospital. On August 3, 1943, Patton visited the 15th Evacuation Hospital near the town of Nicosia. This was something he did regularly, visiting the wounded, pinning medals on those who had earned them, saying a few words of encouragement. He genuinely cared about his soldiers in a way that many people would not have expected from a man known for his hardness. Patton moved down the row of cots, stopping at each man, asking questions, shaking hands. Then he came to a soldier named Private Charles Cool. Cool bore no visible wound. Patton asked what was wrong with him. Cool answered that he couldn't take it anymore. Patton looked at Cool's medical chart. The doctor's notes read, anxiety neurosis. In Patton's mind, the conclusion arrived instantly and with certainty. This was a coward. This was a man who had left his comrades out there in the field to hide in a hospital without legitimate cause. He slapped Cool, not lightly, hard enough to knock Cool out of his chair. Then he turned and continued moving through the ward as though nothing had happened. The hospital's commanding officer, Colonel Donald Carrier, witnessed everything. He filed a report and sent it up the chain of command. Eisenhower received it, read it, and put it in a drawer without making it public, because the Sicilian campaign was not yet over, and he needed Patton. 7 days later, history repeated itself, this time at the 93rd Evacuation Hospital. Private Paul Bennett, age 21, was sitting in a corner of the ward crying. Bennett had fought in North Africa and Sicily without rest. His closest friend had just been killed by artillery fire in front of his eyes. He had been found shaking, unable to speak coherently. When Patton arrived and asked, Bennett said he thought he was going to break down. Patton listened, and his face flushed red. He slapped Bennett, harder than the first time. Then he drew his pistol, not aiming it at anyone, simply holding it, and screamed into Bennett's face that men like this did not deserve to be in the same hospital as soldiers who had been truly wounded. This time, there was a journalist present. Correspondent Demari Bess of the Saturday Evening Post witnessed everything. The story spread. 3 other war correspondents also learned of the incidents. They went to Eisenhower with questions. He could no longer keep it buried. He summoned Patton and told him plainly that this was unacceptable, and that Patton would apologize publicly, directly and in person, before his soldiers in every unit. Patton complied. He went to each unit, stood before his men, and apologized. Many soldiers wept, not out of pity for him, but because they respected him and could not bear to see him brought to this. But the apology could not save his career at that moment. When the story was widely published in November 1943, the reaction of the American public was so fierce that Eisenhower faced enormous pressure from Congress and President Roosevelt. Many senators demanded Patton be dismissed immediately. Eisenhower refused to fire him. He believed Patton was too important to discard. But he also could not continue putting Patton in command of fighting forces under those circumstances. The solution was this: remove Patton from all near-term combat planning. while other generals prepared for the Normandy campaign, the campaign that would decide the fate of the entire war. Patton was set aside. He sat in a house in Sicily, reading newspapers, reading history, watching his colleagues plan the largest military operation in the history of warfare. Not invited to participate, not consulted, with nothing to do but wait. In his diary, he wrote one line that still carries its pain across the decades. "This is the worst punishment that can be given to a soldier. Not prison, not dismissal, but being made to sit and watch while others go to war." But George Patton's story did not end here, far from ending in disgrace, because in Washington, the sharpest minds in the American military were looking at Patton and seeing not a problem to be managed, but a weapon waiting to be used correctly. Chapter 4. Operation Fortitude, a secret weapon in the form of a decoy. By late 1943, the Allies faced the hardest strategic problem of the entire Second World War. They needed to land on the coast of France, open a western front, and begin the final drive into the heart of Germany. But to do that, they had to breach one of the most formidable defensive systems human beings had ever built. Hitler called it Festung Europa, Fortress Europe. All along the western coastline of Europe, from Norway down to Spain, the Germans had constructed thousands of concrete fortifications, laid millions of mines, and driven hundreds of thousands of sharpened stakes into the seabed to destroy landing craft. Behind those fortifications waited millions of German soldiers. The problem was not whether the Allies had enough men to land. They did. The problem was where. The French coastline stretched for hundreds of kilometers. If the Germans knew in advance where the landing would come, they would concentrate their entire force at that point and destroy it in the first minutes. The question the Allied commanders had to answer was not how to land. It was how to make the Germans believe the landing would come at one place while it actually came somewhere else entirely. And in those discussions, one name kept surfacing. Not because the man himself had proposed anything, but because the Germans feared him more than any other Allied commander. That man was George S. Patton. To understand why Patton became the centerpiece of the greatest deception operation in history, you first need to understand what the Germans thought of him. German military intelligence, the Abwehr, kept close watch on all senior Allied commanders. They maintained detailed dossiers on each one, assessments of capability, fighting style, strengths, and weaknesses. And among all those dossiers, the file on Patton was marked as special. The Germans rated Patton as the most dangerous commander on the Allied side, not because he was the strongest, but because he was the least predictable. Montgomery fought by the book, prepared carefully, advanced slowly and steadily. You could anticipate what Montgomery would do next. But Patton was different. He attacked from directions no one expected, at moments no one anticipated, with a speed that the German command structure could not react to in time. One German general said after the war that every morning the first question his intelligence officer raised was not where the British were or what the Americans were doing in general. It was, where is Patton right now, and what is he preparing to do? And Hitler, for all his strategic blind spots, shared this assessment of Patton. He believed that when the Allies decided to make their greatest landing, they would give the command to their best man. And their best man, in Hitler's eyes, was Patton. This German perception, accurate or not, would become the weapon the Allies used to shift the course of the war. Early 1944. the Allied planning staff in London began constructing one of the most elaborate deception operations in the history of warfare. They called it Operation Fortitude. Fortitude's objective was simple to state and extraordinarily difficult to execute. Make the Germans believe the main landing would come at Pas-de-Calais, the closest point between England and France, only 33 kilometers across the water, while the actual landing took place at Normandy, hundreds of kilometers to the west.
Why Pas-de-Calais?
Because it was the most militarily logical choice. The shortest crossing, the least dangerous for landing craft, and once a bridgehead there was secured, the road to Berlin was far shorter than from Normandy. The Germans knew this too, and had concentrated their strongest defensive forces precisely there. But because Pas-de-Calais was so logical, so obvious, Eisenhower and the Allied commanders chose Normandy. Strike where it is least expected. This was the lesson Patton had taught them, indirectly, through the way he fought in Sicily. And this was the moment Patton entered the story in a way he had never imagined. He was called in and told he had been appointed commander of the 1st United States Army Group, known as FUSAG. This was the force that would execute the primary landing, the largest landing, into Pas-de-Calais. Patton heard the news and felt his heart beat faster. At last. After all those months of waiting, he had been given the most important assignment of the war. Then they explained the rest. FUSA did not exist. FUSAG was an army that lived entirely on paper and inside German minds. No real soldiers, no real tanks, no real headquarters with real generals sitting around planning real operations. Instead, Allied intelligence constructed an enormous illusion. In the fields of Kent, hundreds of dummy tanks were erected, built from inflated rubber and plywood. From German reconnaissance aircraft, they were indistinguishable from real Sherman tanks. Around them, fake barracks, fake fuel depots, fake motor pools. An entire vast military base assembled without a single real soldier inside it. Allied intelligence employed hundreds of wireless operators working around the clock, transmitting fake messages about training exercises, supply requisitions, and tactical conferences that never took place. All of it used codes the Germans could break, because the entire point was for German intelligence to read those messages and believe them. On top of that, the Allies held an advantage the Germans never knew about. Nearly the entire network of German agents that had been planted in Britain had long since been discovered and arrested. Rather than executing these spies, British intelligence, MI5, had quietly turned them into double agents, compelling them to send Berlin fabricated reports about FUSAG and about Patton. And at the center of all of it stood Patton. He appeared publicly in places where German intelligence was certain to see him and file reports. He attended dinners in London, where neutral foreign diplomats, who typically maintained back-channel contact with the German side, were present. He inspected units in southeastern England, where FUSAG was supposedly assembling. His image, in his unmistakable uniform, gleaming helmet and ivory-handled pistols, appeared precisely where it needed to appear. Berlin received the reports. Patton was in southeastern England. FUSAG was assembling in Kent. The landing at Pas-de-Calais was coming. Hitler and the German High Command believed those reports. They reinforced the defenses at Pas-de-Calais. They held their finest armored divisions there, ready to repel Patton's landing when it came. Those divisions never received orders to move to Normandy, and that would decide the fate of the war. April 1944. Patton was invited to attend the opening of a welcoming club for American soldiers in the town of Knutsford in Cheshire, England. It was a small, entirely civilian occasion, nothing significant. Patton came because he had been asked, said a few social pleasantries, and left. And as had happened too many times in his life, his mouth betrayed him at precisely the worst possible moment. In his brief remarks, Patton said something to the effect that after the war ended, the responsibility for governing the world would fall to the British and the Americans. He made no mention of the Soviet Union, the critical ally currently sacrificing millions of lives on the Eastern Front. The reaction came from every direction. The American press accused him of insulting the Soviet allies. Congress demanded explanations. Senators called for his immediate dismissal. Moscow filed a formal diplomatic protest. Eisenhower received the news and felt as though he had been punched in the stomach. He summoned Patton and did not conceal his anger. He said plainly that this time he had genuinely considered dismissing him, that no man, however gifted, could continue producing scandals of this kind without consequences. Patton stood and listened without arguing or defending himself. He knew that this time he had come very close to the edge. Eisenhower ultimately did not fire him. The reason was simple and coldly practical. Operation Fortitude was at its most critical stage. If Patton vanished from the picture now, the Germans would grow suspicious. They might conclude that Fusag was a fiction, that Patton was not truly commanding the main landing. And if they pulled forces from Pas-de-Calais to Normandy before June 6th, the cost would be measured in tens of thousands of lives. So Patton remained, still in his distinctive uniform, still appearing in places where German intelligence could observe him, still playing the role of a general preparing for the greatest landing in history, a landing he would have no part in. June 6, 1944, D-Day. Nearly 160,000 Allied soldiers landed on 5 beaches in Normandy in the largest amphibious assault in history. Thousands died in the first hours. George Patton was not there. He sat in England, listening to the news on a radio like an ordinary civilian. The general the Germans feared most, the man around whom the entire vast machinery of Operation Fortitude had been constructed, sat alone in a room while history was being written on the coast of France. In his diary that day, he wrote a single sentence: "It is terrible to sit here and wait." But even on D-Day, Operation Fortitude had not run its course. When the news of the Normandy landing reached Hitler, his first reaction was not to order the armored divisions at Pas-de-Calais to move toward Normandy. His first reaction was doubt. Hitler believed Normandy was a feint, that the real landing, the one commanded by Patton, was still coming at Pas-de-Calais. He kept his forces in place, waiting for Patton to strike. Meanwhile, German commanders in Normandy were sending desperate requests for reinforcement. They were refused. The 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte, one of the most formidable fighting units in the German military, was stationed near Pas-de-Calais and could have reached Normandy within a day. But Hitler would not permit the move because he still believed Patton was coming. Those days of Hitler's hesitation gave the Allies precious time to consolidate their bridgehead at Normandy. Historians later calculated that if the German armoured divisions had been sent to Normandy within the first 48 hours after D-Day, the outcome of the landing might have been entirely different. After the war ended, as German generals were interrogated and captured German documents were decoded, the full picture of Fortitude's effectiveness slowly came into focus. General Gerd von Rundstedt, commander of German forces on the Western Front, acknowledged that he had been certain Fusag was the primary landing force until the very end of July 1944, nearly 2 months after D-Day. Throughout that entire period, 19 of Germany's finest divisions stood motionless at Pas de Calais, waiting for Patton's assault. 19 divisions. Consider that number. Each division, roughly 15,000 to 20,000 men, plus tanks, artillery, and armored vehicles. Perhaps 300,000 to 400,000 elite German soldiers standing idle while their comrades in Normandy were pushed back, step by step. Had even half of them been sent to Normandy in the first week after D-Day, history might have been written entirely differently. British historian Roger Hesketh, who studied Operation Fortitude more thoroughly than anyone, assessed it as the most successful deception operation in the history of warfare. Not because it was the most complex or sophisticated, but because its effects exceeded by far anything its designers had dared to hope for. And at the center of that operation was a man who never fully knew that he was playing the most important role of the war, not by commanding a battle, but by doing nothing at all. Meanwhile, Patton waited. Day after day, week after week. He read history, wrote in his diary, exercised. He knew he was being used as a decoy, and he had no choice but to accept it. But he also knew what Eisenhower knew. When the real moment came, when someone was needed to stand at the head of an army and fight real battles, no one would do it better than him. And that day was drawing close. July 1944. After more than a month of brutal fighting to hold and expand the Normandy bridgehead, the Allies were preparing for Operation Cobra, the great breakout into the interior of France. And at last, after all the months of waiting, the name that German soldiers feared most appeared on the list of commanders who would take part. On August 1st, 1944, the United States Third Army was officially activated, with Patton in command. He read the orders, folded them carefully, and placed them in his breast pocket. Then he looked at the staff officers standing around him and said, in a tone so level no one could tell whether he was serious or not, "Gentlemen, I have waited 35 years for this moment. I do not intend to wait any longer." Ahead lay France. Ahead lay the battles people would speak of for 100 years. Ahead lay the summit of a life built for this one moment. George Patton, age 58, climbed into his command jeep and ordered the advance. Chapter 5. The Third Army, the peak of a genius. On August 1st, 1944, the Third Army officially began combat operations. And from the very first days, it was clear that what Patton brought was not merely experience or tactics, it was tempo. While most other Allied units were advancing carefully, step by step, consolidating positions before pushing forward, the Third Army moved like floodwater breaking through a dam. No stopping, no waiting, no looking back. In the first 3 weeks since activation, the Third Army liberated more than 10,000 square kilometers of French territory. Patton's speed of advance was so great that the Allied logistics system could not keep up. Supply trucks carrying fuel and ammunition were not fast enough to reach the units pushing forward. On multiple occasions, Third Army tanks were forced to halt not because of the Germans, but because they had run out of fuel. Patton was furious. He called Eisenhower directly, demanding priority allocation of fuel. He said that if given enough gasoline, he could end the war before winter. Eisenhower listened, but could not work miracles. The Allied supply system had been designed for a normal pace of advance, not for the kind of relentless movement Patton demanded. But even with those forced stops, the Third Army still advanced faster than any other formation on the Western Front. Because Patton's philosophy was not simply to move fast, it was to move smart. He did not attack into German strongpoints. He went around them. He drove straight into the gaps in the enemy's line, punching into their rear areas, severing their supply routes, forcing them to retreat or surrender because they had been encircled. A fortified defensive position might hold out for weeks against a frontal assault, but when its supply lines were cut and enemy forces were closing in from behind, it became worthless within hours. To understand why Patton succeeded where many other generals, with the same troop strength and the same weapons, could not achieve comparable results, one must understand the tactical philosophy he had constructed and refined over 30 years. His first and most fundamental principle was that speed conquers everything. Not the speed of an individual soldier or a single tank, but the speed of the entire organization. The speed of decision-making, the speed of response to a changing situation. He believed that a good plan executed now was better than a perfect plan executed next week, because in war, next week might already be too late. His second principle was radical decentralization of command. Patton gave his subordinate generals clear objectives and left it to them to decide how to achieve them. He did not want junior officers calling back to headquarters for permission every time a situation developed. He wanted them to think for themselves, decide for themselves, and keep moving forward. This sounds simple, but it was genuinely revolutionary in the military organization of that era. Traditional armies operated on centralized command, every important decision waiting for orders from above. Patton believed the opposite. The man on the ground understood the situation better than the man at the rear headquarters, and therefore the man on the ground must have the authority to decide. His third principle, and this was what made the greatest difference in terms of morale, was command from the front. Patton did not sit in a safe headquarters at the rear and issue orders over the telephone. He went to the front, made himself present where his soldiers were fighting and dying. This seems reckless and unnecessary for a senior general. But Patton understood something that many others did not. Soldiers fight better when they know their commander is with them. Not because they need protection or reassurance, but because the commander's presence is evidence that what is being asked of them is actually possible. There is a story that many veterans who served under Patton used to tell. They said that on exhausting marches, feet aching, bodies frozen, spirits at their lowest, if they caught sight of Patton's jeep going by with its 3-star flag snapping in the wind, something in their chests would flare up without warning. Not because he was a kind or gentle general, but because he was someone who never quit. And that quality was contagious. That is not magic. That is leadership. In August 1944, an opportunity without precedent in the entire Second World War opened before the Allies. And the way it was handled, or rather not handled correctly, became one of the great historical controversies of the war. After weeks of rapid advance, Patton's Third Army had swung around to the south and was now driving north toward Argentan. At the same time, Canadian forces from the north were pushing south toward Falaise. If those two thrusts met, the entire German Army Group B, roughly 100,000 soldiers and hundreds of tanks, would be completely encircled inside an enormous pocket. Patton looked at the map and understood immediately. He reached Argentan on August 13th, only about 20 kilometers from Falaise. One more day's advance, and he could close the pocket from the south. He called General Omar Bradley, his direct superior, and asked permission to continue north to Falaise. Bradley refused. The reason given was that the operational boundary had been drawn in advance. The area north of Argentan belonged to the Canadian sector, not the American. If Patton advanced into it, two Allied forces could collide in the fog and confusion of the battlefield and fire on each other. This was a technically sound military argument, but Patton would not accept it. He told Bradley, "I can get to Falaise and close that pocket before the Canadians arrive. If we don't do it now, we lose this chance forever." Bradley still refused. Orders were orders. That evening, Patton wrote in his diary, "We could have ended the war here, but they will not let me do it." While Patton stood fast at Argentan, the gap between the two closing arms of the trap remained open, and the Germans, recognizing their desperate position, began streaming through that gap around the clock. When the gap was finally closed on August 21st, the Allies had captured roughly 50,000 prisoners and destroyed a significant force. But an estimated 20,000 to 40,000 German soldiers had escaped, taking with them tanks and irreplaceable combat experience. Those men would fight again in the battles ahead. Had the Falaise pocket been sealed completely, might the war have ended many months sooner? No one can say with certainty, but historians debate that question to this day. After Falaise, the Third Army continued east at undiminished speed. While Paris was liberated on August 25th by the Free French and American forces under Eisenhower's special order, Patton did not stop at the City of Light. He looked at Paris on the map and told his staff officers something many of them never forgot. Paris is a trap. An army that enters a large city spends weeks getting back out. We have no time for things like that. The Third Army crossed the Seine at the end of August, drove into the Lorraine region, and pointed toward the German border. In less than 4 weeks since activation, Patton's forces had covered a distance that planners had estimated would take many months. But then, in early September 1944, the thing Patton feared most occurred. Not the Germans, not difficult terrain. He ran out of fuel. Eisenhower was facing a difficult strategic choice. Prioritize fuel for Patton's eastward drive or for Montgomery's northward push through Belgium and the Netherlands. Two axes of advance were competing for the same finite supply. Eisenhower chose Montgomery. Patton's fuel allocation was cut abruptly. He was incensed. He called, he cabled, he even flew back to see Eisenhower in person. He argued that this was the moment when German forces were disintegrating, their fighting spirit at its lowest ebb, that if the Third Army received sufficient fuel, he could cross the Rhine and enter German territory before winter. Eisenhower did not change his decision. Later, many historians argued that Eisenhower may have made a serious strategic miscalculation in this period. Had Patton been fully fueled in September 1944, when German forces were in disarray and had not yet reorganized their defenses, might the war have ended before winter? That question has no certain answer. But what unfolded in the winter of 1944 suggests that the opportunity missed in September was paid for at a very high price. December 16th, 1944. The cold was bone-cutting in the forests of the Ardennes, straddling Belgium, Luxembourg and Germany. And in the fog of that morning, the Germans did what the Allies had believed was no longer possible. Hitler launched Germany's final great counter-offensive, known as Operation Wacht am Rhein, the Battle of the Bulge. 25 German divisions with more than 400,000 troops and nearly 1,000 tanks struck without warning into the thinnest sector of the American line in the Ardennes. The attack produced complete chaos. American units were cut off, encircled, and destroyed piecemeal. In the first few days, the Germans drove more than 80 kilometers into the Allied front, creating a vast protrusion on the map, which is why it came to be called the Battle of the Bulge. Among the most critical points, Bastogne emerged as the symbol of the entire battle. The town was the most important road junction in the region, where 7 major roads converged. Whoever controlled Bastogne controlled the entire area. And now the Germans were surrounding it from every direction. The 101st Airborne Division, under the command of Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, was holding the town. They were short of food, ammunition, and medicine. Snow was too heavy for aircraft to drop supplies, and the temperature had fallen to -20 degrees Celsius. On December 19th, Eisenhower convened an emergency meeting with his most senior commanders. The situation was grave enough that Eisenhower declared at the outset this was not a meeting to analyze a disaster, it was a meeting to find a solution. And he opened with a direct question: who could counterattack into the southern flank of the German offensive, drive to Bastogne, and relieve the 101st Airborne? The room was quiet. Moving toward Bastogne meant turning north, driving through the snow-choked Ardennes and through German forces. The distance from the nearest American positions to Bastogne was over 150 kilometers, and that was as the crow flies, not through winter mountain forest. Patton stood up. He said, "I can attack with 3 divisions on December 23rd. That is 4 days from now." The room was quiet for a few seconds. Then a few soft laughs rose. Not mockery, the laughter of men who had just heard something that sounded too good to be true. 4 days. To pivot 3 full divisions, roughly 60,000 men, along with all their tanks, artillery, and transport, from facing east to facing north in 4 days in the dead of winter, then drive 150 kilometers through the Ardennes into the flank of a German force in full offensive momentum. No one had ever done it. No one in military history had ever done anything comparable in so little time. Eisenhower asked directly, "Patton, if you attack before you're ready, you'll be defeated, and the situation will be worse than it is now." Patton answered with an almost eerie calm, "General, I am already ready. I drew up the plans for this situation 3 days ago." Patton was not bluffing. When news of the German offensive reached him on December 16th, he did not panic as many others did. He looked at the map and immediately understood he would be called upon to counterattack. He gathered his staff, and within a few hours they had sketched out 3 distinct options: an attack with 2 divisions, 3 divisions, or 4 divisions along 3 different axes. All of it already prepared, waiting for the order. When Eisenhower called to confirm the request, Patton hung up and turned to his Chief of Staff, General Hobart Gay, and said 2 words: Plan 2. That night, and the 3 nights that followed, the Third Army executed one of the largest and most complex movements in the history of warfare. Tens of thousands of vehicles changed direction, rerouted their march, and moved through narrow, frozen roads in total darkness. No headlights to avoid detection by German aircraft. Drivers navigated by the faint, reflected glow of the snow. Vehicles slid off the road. Bridges had to be reinforced on the fly to bear the weight of tanks. But no one stopped. No one turned back. On December 23rd, exactly as Patton had promised, the Third Army launched its attack toward Bastogne, heading north through the Ardennes, through snow and ice, through the German defensive lines. The German forces surrounding Bastogne could not believe what they were seeing. They had not imagined that the Americans could pivot a force that large and attack that fast from a completely unexpected direction. On December 26, 1944, at 4:50 in the afternoon, tanks of the 37th Tank Battalion, 4th Armored Division, broke through the encirclement and drove into Bastogne. The siege was broken after 10 days. Bastogne was saved, and Hitler's counteroffensive, which he had expected to split the Allied armies and create conditions for a negotiated peace, began to collapse from that moment forward. When a reporter asked McAuliffe what he thought of Patton, the exhausted commander of Bastogne answered simply, "Without him, we would all be dead."
As for Patton,
that evening he wrote in his diary one sentence that carried no trace of arrogance, only plain truth. "The best moment of my life." In early 1945, after completely repelling the German counteroffensive in the Ardennes, the Allies drove toward the Rhine, the final natural barrier protecting German territory. Crossing the Rhine was the last step before the drive into the heart of Germany. Montgomery was preparing an elaborate Rhine crossing operation in the north. He had assembled thousands of boats and barges, arranged massive artillery support, and planned the operation down to the hour. It was to be called Operation Varsity and Plunder, scheduled for March 24th. Patton did not wait until March 24th. On the night of March 22, 1945, the 5th Infantry Division of the Third Army began crossing the Rhine at Oppenheim, hundreds of kilometers south of where Montgomery would cross. No thundering preliminary artillery, no announcement. They quietly crossed in small boats under cover of darkness, establishing a bridgehead on the eastern bank before the Germans could react. On the morning of March 23rd, Patton called Bradley and reported, in the same tone a man might use to discuss the weather, "Brad, we crossed the Rhine last night. Every boat was loaded with troops. We didn't lose a man." Bradley laughed. Then he said, "I'm going to announce this right now, before Monty crosses." The next day, March 24th, Montgomery executed Operation Varsity and Plunder with the support of 3,500 artillery pieces and an entire airborne corps dropped from the sky. It was a spectacular, meticulously planned operation. But Patton had crossed the night before without a single shot. Walking across the bridge, Patton stopped in the middle, turned to his aides and said, "I've been promising myself this." Then he spat into the Rhine. Those around him did not understand at first. Then one officer recalled that months earlier, looking east and speaking of Germany, Patton had said that when he crossed the Rhine, he would do what William the Conqueror had done when he landed on the English shore in 1066. Trip, fall flat on his face, then rise and declare he held England in his hands. But Patton had his own style. After crossing the Rhine, the Third Army drove deep into German territory at a pace that surprised even Patton. German forces were disintegrating. The prisoners being taken were growing younger by the day, many just 15 or 16 years old, or older, men of 50 and 55 conscripted in the final desperate weeks. In the last weeks of the war, the Third Army was advancing 50 kilometers a day. Not because German resistance had become negligible, but because the German will to fight had completely collapsed. On April 4, 1945, lead elements of the Third Army entered Ohrdruf, a forced labor camp within the Buchenwald concentration camp system. It was the first death camp liberated by American forces in the war. What they found inside was beyond any language to fully describe. Bodies stacked in piles, survivors reduced to nothing but skin over bone, eyes sunken and unfocused. Evidence of atrocities carried out systematically, deliberately, over years.
Eisenhower ordered all senior commanders in Germany to visit Ohrdruf.
He said that high-ranking witnesses were needed so that no one could ever deny what had happened there. Patton visited the camp alongside Eisenhower and Bradley. It was one of the very few moments in his life when those who accompanied him witnessed him genuinely lose control of his emotions. He walked outside and was sick. Then he stood in silence for a long time, his face drained of color, saying nothing. When he returned inside, he ordered all the residents of the surrounding village to be rounded up and brought to see what was inside the camp. Forced to look, forced to understand that this had taken place right beside where they had been living. In his diary that night, Patton wrote, "I have seen many things in war, but I did not know that human beings could do this to other human beings. Anyone who says this is a war we did not need to fight should come here and see for themselves." May 8, 1945. Germany surrendered unconditionally. The Second World War in Europe was over. Across America and Europe, people celebrated, weeping, embracing, dancing in the streets. After nearly 6 years of war, after tens of millions dead, after losses beyond measuring, peace had returned. George Patton did not celebrate. Not because he felt no joy at the peace, but because he was looking east and seeing what few people wanted to think about on that day. Soviet armies were standing at the center of Europe. They had occupied all of East Germany, Poland, and most of Eastern Europe, and there was no sign they intended to withdraw. In his diary on May 8, 1945, Patton wrote a sentence that would later become famous and controversial in equal measure to anything he had ever done in the war. "We have defeated the wrong enemy." The war was over. But for Patton, his greatest troubles were only just beginning. Chapter 6. The Shadow Behind the Glory. After May 8, 1945, the American military began a new mission, occupying and administering a defeated Germany. This was no longer war. This was administration. And George Patton, a man born to command armies in combat, had to learn to do something he had never been good at: govern in peacetime. He was appointed military governor of Bavaria, the large region in southern Germany. His task was to help rebuild the local administrative apparatus, maintain order, distribute food, and begin the process of denazification, removing those who had been members of the Nazi Party from positions in government and public life. From his very first days in the new role, Patton revealed views that would pull him into the worst trouble of his life. He believed that to rebuild Bavaria quickly and effectively, it was necessary to retain men with administrative experience, people who knew how to run a local government. The problem was that most of those people had been Nazi Party members, because throughout the 12 years of Hitler's rule, no one could advance to any position in the state apparatus without joining the party. Patton began appointing some former Nazi members to administrative posts. He argued that he was using competent people to stabilize the situation, not protecting war criminals. This policy immediately provoked fierce backlash from the American press and from Washington.
This was 1945, in the immediate aftermath of the world having seen what had happened in the concentration camps. The idea of restoring former Nazis to positions of authority was considered morally unacceptable. Eisenhower summoned Patton and demanded an explanation. The meeting was so tense that the two men, long-standing friends despite their frequent disagreements, could no longer look at each other the way they once had. On September 22, 1945, Patton held a press conference at Bad Tölz, one of the routine briefings that occupation commanders organized to keep the press informed. A reporter asked about the denazification policy, specifically why Patton was still retaining some former Nazi members in the Bavarian administrative structure, despite orders to remove them. Patton answered in his characteristic fashion with a bluntness that had long since ceased to be wise. He said that the matter of the Nazi Party was really not so different from someone being a Republican or a Democrat in America. It was simply a political organization that people joined for various reasons, not necessarily because they believed in its ideology. The press room was silent for a few seconds. Then the sound of pens scratching furiously across notepads filled the air. Patton may not have realized in that moment what he had just said. Or perhaps he realized and did not care, because it was what he genuinely thought, and he had never developed the habit of saying anything other than what was on his mind. The news reached Washington within hours. The reaction was more severe than anything that had come before. Comparing the Nazi Party to an American political party, in 1945, in the immediate aftermath of the world learning of the Holocaust, of seeing the images from Ohrdruf, Buchenwald and Dachau, that was not merely politically wrong. It was a profound insult to every person who had fought and sacrificed to defeat fascism, to every survivor of the concentration camps, to every family that had lost someone in the war. Eisenhower summoned Patton immediately. This meeting was unlike any that had come before. In previous confrontations, however tense, Eisenhower had always found a way to keep Patton in place because he was needed for the war. But the war was over. There was no longer any reason to shield him from the consequences of his own words. Eisenhower informed him that Patton was relieved of command of the Third Army and of his position as military governor of Bavaria. He was transferred to command the 15th Army, a formation with no actual combat troops, tasked only with researching and compiling the history of the war. Patton received the order without protest, without argument, without apology. He simply stood, saluted, and walked out. Later in his diary he wrote, "So it ends, 35 years, and it ends like this." After the war, when Patton's diaries and correspondence were published in full, the darker corners of his character came into clearer view. And those corners raise uncomfortable questions that cannot be avoided when telling his story honestly. The first and most contested issue is that passages in his diaries and private letters reveal Patton held deep prejudices towards certain groups of people. There are passages in which he wrote about Jewish people in plainly discriminatory language, particularly after visiting displaced persons camps housing Jewish survivors of the Holocaust in Germany. In September 1945, Patton visited a Jewish displaced persons camp at Eisenhower's request, following reports that living conditions there were not being improved quickly enough. In his diary after the visit, he wrote passages that have since become one of the darkest marks on his legacy, describing the survivors in contemptuous language, entirely devoid of empathy, rather than seeing them as human beings who had just endured the worst atrocity in recorded history. Those passages cannot be excused by any argument. They were not simply products of their era. Even by the standards of 1945, they went beyond what was acceptable.
and they were not a momentary lapse, appearing as they do repeatedly over many years. The second issue is the way Patton regarded soldiers suffering from psychological wounds, of which the slapping incidents of 1943 were only the most visible expression. He believed deeply that all soldiers endured the same hardships of war, and that anyone who could not continue fighting without a physical wound was displaying weakness of will, not illness. This view was entirely wrong from a medical and psychological standpoint. Combat trauma, today recognized as PTSD, is a genuine medical condition involving measurable physiological changes in the brain, not a choice or a form of cowardice. But in Patton's time, understanding of this was still rudimentary, and he was far from alone in holding such views within the American military. That does not make his actions right, but it does help place them in their proper historical context, rather than simply labeling him a cruel man and moving on. The third issue is the question of casualties. The Third Army under Patton advanced faster than any other formation, but moving fast in war does not always mean fewer losses. There were engagements in which Patton ordered attacks without waiting for adequate artillery preparation, without waiting for reconnaissance to confirm enough information, because he believed speed mattered more than perfection. In some cases, this produced higher casualties than were necessary. Soldiers died in attacks that an extra day of preparation might have avoided. Whether Patton's pace of advance, viewed in totality, shortened the war enough to save more lives than were lost to his urgency, that equation has no clear answer. But to truly understand Patton, one cannot look only at what he did wrong. One must look at the contradictions within the man, because it is precisely those contradictions that make him so unusually complex. George Patton, famous for a hardness that could seem cruel, a man whom soldiers feared as much as many things in war, was a man who wept genuinely when his soldiers died, not performative weeping, but alone in his room after everyone had gone. After every major battle, Patton visited the field cemeteries where his soldiers were buried. He walked the rows of graves, reading each name, and in his diary he recorded the casualty counts not as statistics, but as human beings, each with a name and a story. He wrote in a letter to Beatrice, "You know, every night I dream about the dead. Not nightmares, they just stand there looking at me. I don't know what that means." His religious faith was among the most striking of his contradictions. He was a genuine believer, not in any formal or ceremonial sense. He read the Bible regularly, prayed before and after every battle, and believed that God concerned himself with the outcome of the wars in which Patton fought. The most famous instance of this was the prayer for good weather before Bastogne. In the winter of 1944, low cloud had blanketed the Ardennes for days, grounding Allied aircraft and preventing air support. Patton called his chaplain, Father James O'Neill, and asked him to write a prayer asking God for good weather. Father O'Neill hesitated at first. Asking God to change the weather in order to kill more people more effectively was theologically unusual, but Patton said plainly, "I need good weather to defeat the Germans and save my soldiers' lives. I believe God cares about that." The prayer was distributed to all 250,000 soldiers of the Third Army. On December 23rd, the weather broke. The sky cleared. Allied aircraft took off and began striking German units surrounding Bastogne. Coincidence or miracle? Patton did not ask that question. To him, it was an answered prayer. And perhaps the sharpest of all his contradictions was in his relationship with Beatrice. The man who showed no mercy on the battlefield, whom many soldiers described in terms unprintable in a newspaper, came home and wrote to his wife every day when they were apart, played with his children, and attended to the small details of his wife's life with genuine care. Beatrice once told friends that the George at home and the George on the battlefield were two entirely different people, and she did not know which one was the real man. Perhaps both were. Among the most contentious aspects of Patton's final months was his view of the Soviet Union and of what he called the true danger that remained after Germany's defeat. From the early months of 1945, as Soviet forces advanced into Eastern Europe, Patton had begun expressing concern, not to the press, but in his diary and in private conversations with those he trusted, that the Soviet Union was building a new empire in Europe to replace the one just destroyed. He believed that when German forces were disintegrating and their morale was at its lowest, that was the moment to keep driving east, to rearm German prisoners and attack the Soviets before they could consolidate their position in Eastern Europe. He genuinely proposed this, not as a reckless fantasy, but as a serious strategic calculation. Eisenhower and Washington rejected the idea entirely. The Soviet Union was an ally. The war had just ended. People in America, Britain, and around the world were celebrating peace. No one wanted to hear about a new war. Looking back through the lens of history, Patton's concerns about the Soviet Union contained an undeniable measure of truth. The Cold War unfolded almost precisely as he had warned. Eastern Europe lived under the shadow of Soviet power for nearly half a century. The Berlin Wall, the Korean War, the Cuban Missile Crisis, all were expressions of what Patton had been warning about in 1945. But that does not mean the solution he proposed was correct. Attacking the Soviet Union in 1945, when they had millions of battle-hardened soldiers standing at the center of Europe, when the entire world had just endured 6 years of war, when no one yet knew where the widespread use of atomic weapons might lead, was an idea that could have produced a catastrophe far greater than the one just ended. Patton saw the problem clearly, but his solution, as so often in his life, was to attack it head-on, without the patience to think through the long-term consequences. Looking at George Patton as a whole, the hardest thing is not cataloguing what he did right or wrong. The hardest thing is accepting that both exist inseparably within the same man. He was the man who saved 20,000 soldiers at Bastogne, and the man who struck a suffering soldier in a hospital. He was the man who wept before the graves of his troops, and the man who drove them forward through gunfire without a moment's hesitation. He was the man who prayed sincerely, and the man who wrote passages in his diary that deserve no defense. He was the man who saw the danger of the Soviet Union before almost anyone else, and the man who proposed a solution that could have ignited World War III. There is a question many people ask when studying Patton. Were his darker qualities the inseparable counterpart of his greatness? Was his fearlessness connected to his lack of empathy? Was his absolute self-confidence connected to the arrogance that sometimes crossed into prejudice? There is no definitive answer, but the question deserves to be asked, because Patton's story is not a story about a flawless hero or a villain deserving condemnation. It is a story about a fully real human being, with all the complexity and contradiction that entails. In October 1945, the Third Army was officially deactivated. The 3-star flag was lowered. The soldiers went home.
back to their families, back to the ordinary lives that many of them had not dared believe they would see again. Patton stood and watched the flag come down, his eyes dry. But those who stood beside him later said that his jaw was clenched and his hands were balled into fists at his sides. He was 60 years old. He had spent his entire life preparing for and fighting in this war. And now it was over. He did not know who he was when there was no longer a war to fight. In a letter to Beatrice in late October 1945, he wrote, "I don't know what to do with myself in peacetime. I only know war. And now that war is gone, I find myself wondering whether there is still a place for someone like me in this new world." Chapter 7. The Mysterious Death and the Questions That Remain.
December 1945. George Patton was counting down his final days on German soil before returning to America. He had been told his flight home would come in mid-December. After that, retirement was the most likely prospect. A military career spanning 40 years was drawing to a close. Beatrice was waiting for him at home in Massachusetts. The two of them had made plans for his return: rides on horseback across the fields, quiet dinners, visits with the grandchildren, the ordinary things that ordinary people do, and that Patton had never truly had throughout a life in uniform. His work at the 15th Army, the unit tasked with compiling the history of the war to which he had been reassigned after the scandal in September, was not something that stirred him. Reading and writing about battles that others had fought was not Patton. But he did it because he had no other choice. Those who met him during this period said he looked tired, in a way entirely different from the exhaustion of war. Not physical weariness, but the weariness of a man who has come to the end of his road and does not know where the next step leads. On December 8th, he told his aide that he wanted to go pheasant hunting one more time before leaving Germany. It was a pastime he had enjoyed throughout his years stationed in Europe. The hunting trip was scheduled for the morning of December 9th. On the morning of December 9th, 1945, Patton and General Hobart Gay, his former chief of staff and close friend, got into a car to drive to the countryside near Mannheim for the hunt. It was a routine outing, nothing unusual on the day's schedule. The convoy consisted of a military olive-green Cadillac Model 75 carrying Patton and Gay, with a Jeep escort following behind. The driver of the Cadillac was Corporal Horace Woodring, 23 years old, who had been Patton's personal driver for several months. At approximately 11:45 in the morning, the convoy was traveling on State Road B38 near the town of Neckarstadt, on the outskirts of Mannheim. The road was straight, visibility was good, and there was nothing complicated about the traffic conditions. Patton and Gay were talking. According to Gay's account afterward, they were discussing the pheasants they hoped to find that morning. Then, from a side road on the left, a U.S. Army GMC 2.5-ton truck turned suddenly out onto the main road. Woodring could not stop in time. The Cadillac struck the truck's side at low speed, estimated at 30 to 40 kilometers per hour. The collision did not look serious. The car was not destroyed. There was no loud explosion. Woodring was unhurt. Gay was unhurt. But Patton, sitting in the right rear seat, was thrown forward when the car stopped abruptly. His head struck the metal partition in front of his seat. Gay turned and saw Patton sitting motionless, eyes open but unresponsive. He called Patton's name. No answer. Gay took his hand and asked loudly, "General, are you all right?" Patton struggled to speak, his voice weak and unclear. "I'm paralyzed. I can't feel anything below my chest." That is what happened on the morning of December 9th, 1945,
on a quiet road on the outskirts of Mannheim, according to every witness present at the scene. Patton was taken immediately to the 131st Station Hospital in Heidelberg, roughly 20 kilometers from the accident site. The doctors examined him and determined he had fractured the third and fourth cervical vertebrae, resulting in complete quadriplegia from the neck down. But his mind was completely intact. He was lucid. He could speak. He recognized everyone and understood everything happening around him. News of the accident spread that same day. Telegrams arrived from around the world. Eisenhower called. President Truman sent a letter of inquiry. The American and European press reported continuously. Beatrice received the news in Massachusetts and immediately booked a flight to Germany. She arrived at her husband's bedside on December 11th, 2 days after the accident. Those working at the hospital recalled that when Beatrice entered the room, Patton saw her, and for the first time since the accident, the tension left his face. He said to her in a voice that was weak but clear, "You're here. Good."
In the days that followed, Patton and Beatrice had long conversations. No one knows exactly what was said in those private hours, as neither shared the details, but those waiting outside the room occasionally heard soft laughter, the sound of Patton's voice telling stories, Beatrice's voice responding. 40 years of marriage, and at last they had time to sit together, without war, without duty, without anything between them, even if the circumstances that brought them to that moment were ones no one would have wished for. Medically, Patton's condition shifted from day to day. On some days, the doctors were cautiously optimistic, as there were no signs of infection and organ function remained normal. On others, his condition worsened, his blood pressure fluctuated, his breathing was irregular. On December 17th, the doctors reported that the prognosis was good enough to consider transferring him back to America by medical aircraft. Beatrice began preparing for the journey home. Patton told her, "You go home first and get everything ready. I'll follow after." Beatrice did not go. She stayed. On the evening of December 21st, Patton fell asleep after a normal conversation with the nurse on duty. No irregularities of any kind were noted before he slept. On the morning of December 21st, 1945, at 5:50 a.m., doctors confirmed that George Smith Patton had died in his sleep. The recorded cause of death was acute pulmonary edema caused by pulmonary embolism, a blood clot that had traveled to the lungs and caused sudden obstruction. This is a complication not uncommon in paralyzed patients, particularly when they cannot move to maintain normal blood circulation. He was 60 years old. And here, the story of George Patton's death begins to grow more complicated than what is recorded in the official medical files. In the decades following Patton's death, quiet questions about the accident and the 12 days he spent in the hospital never fully disappeared. They were not raised publicly or loudly in the early years. No one had sufficient evidence, and an America that had just come through the war was not eager for another heavy mystery. But they did not go away. No document declassified from the OSS or CIA archives has ever confirmed that an order to eliminate Patton existed. No forensic evidence has ever proven that his death was the result of human action rather than natural medical complications. On the other hand, a fatal pulmonary embolism in a paralyzed patient is entirely plausible from a medical standpoint, particularly in 1945, when modern preventive measures such as anticoagulant therapy were not yet in widespread clinical use. The truth is that we do not know. And after 80 years, with most of the witnesses gone, with many documents still classified or long since destroyed,
The prospect of a definitive answer grows more remote with every passing year.
What we can say with certainty is this. George Patton died on December 21st, 1945, 12 days after a minor automobile accident in a military hospital in Heidelberg, Germany. He died at precisely the moment when many people, in Washington as well as Moscow, had reason to want him silent forever. And the questions surrounding what truly happened in those 12 days have never been satisfactorily answered. When news of Patton's death spread, the reaction of the American people was not the simple, uncomplicated grief that greets the passing of an ordinary hero. Some wept, some were indifferent, some felt relief, and many did not know what they felt at all. Because Patton was not the kind of hero who is easy to love. He was not gentle, not humble, not careful with his words. He was rough, divisive, given to saying things that angered and confused people. He was the kind of man who resisted being placed neatly into a comfortable corner of the admirer's heart. But for those who had served under him, the feeling was far less ambiguous. Many veterans of the Third Army said that when they heard Patton was gone, they wept. Not because he had been good to them in any conventional sense, he had not, but because he was the man who had kept them alive when everything around them was trying to kill them. One veteran said in an interview many years after the war, "I hated him when I served under him, but I'm alive today partly because of him, and I don't know what to make of that." The questions surrounding his death may never have certain answers, but the questions surrounding his life, what he did and why, what legacy he left and at what cost, are questions worth continuing to sit with. The life of George Patton is proof that greatness and failure are not mutually exclusive, that those who accomplish extraordinary things are not required to be perfect people, that history is not made by the unblemished, but by those who keep moving forward despite being full of flaws. And perhaps the most important lesson from his story is not about war or tactics. It is about human nature, about how one person can save tens of thousands of lives and still lack the compassion to understand the pain of a soldier sitting weeping in a field hospital, about how genius and blindness can coexist in the same soul, side by side, without ever seeming contradictory to the one who carries them. George Smith Patton. The war god and the shadow. Hero and paradox. The man history needed but did not know how to live with. He lies in Luxembourg, beside the soldiers who served under him, exactly as he would have wanted. And to this day, 80 years later, we are still not certain we fully understand who he was. If you watched until the end, thank you. Not because you gave 2 hours to this video, but because you gave 2 hours to sitting with a true story about a real person with all the complexity that a human life can hold. History is not numbers and battles. History is people. And people like Patton remind us that none of us is only one thing. If this story left something behind in you, even just one small question you had never thought to ask before, then this video has done its work. Leave a comment and let us know what you think of Patton after watching. And if you'd like to see more stories like this one, subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Now, turn off the screen, drink a glass of water, and get a good night's sleep. Good night.